I saw my doctor yesterday for the post-op, and he said, if only all his patients would be in the same condition I am.
Good for you. Yay. That's great news.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So Arnie is back around too, and there's Barbara. Thank you. She's coming on, and Alan also. I just wanted to go ahead and start our session today. I feel a little bit disoriented because I'm doing the Parashat Emor class from Temple as opposed to at home. And in order to make it so that the camera doesn't look right into 3 windows and washes out everything, I turned the computer around. So now I'm on the opposite side of my desk. But anyway, we'll figure this out and go step by step. We're all trying to figure out how we're going to be making that transition to more and more in person as opposed to online. Speaking of which, this past Friday, we had a wonderful gathering of people for in-person services. On Shabbat morning, we had double services, the early minyan plus there was a bat mitzvah, and very nice crowds for both of them. We were spread out and people were wearing their masks except for when they were leading the service or whatever. And it was quite nice to be able to see people and to be in the same room with them. Although we know it's still going to be slow but sure for a while. Just to give you a little bit of, and I know some of you heard that the committee did vote that we'll be up to 100 people in the Zwerin sanctuary. But we're going to send out a survey, hopefully this week or early next. Probably early next week, a survey to sort of see how people are feeling about the high holidays. That'll give us May to sort of figure that out, and June to make the final decisions. So once you start thinking as well as to where you'd like to be, and what's your limit, even it's beginning of September for Rosh Hashanah, would you feel comfortable being in the same room with 1,000 people? If not 1,000, 500, what does that mean, right? So we'll figure this out, but we need your feedback and all the rest. So with that, we have this week's Torah portion is Emor, and it chapters 21, 22, 23 of the book of Leviticus, and it covers in many ways the calendar of the major festivals. And in the Torah, the major festivals, specifically in the spring Pesach and in the fall Sukkot, those were the big experiences for our people. Rosh Hashanah is given 3 verses. Yom Kippur is described in 7 verses. Sukkot has quite a bit, and Pesach, of course, and then all the way into Shavuot, twice as much as that. Shavuot with they count, if you count into that, the traditions of counting the Omer, at which we are right now in the midst of counting the Omer, the time between Mocharat Shabbat, the day after the Passover Seder, all the way to the festival of Shavuot. And it gets us to start thinking how much things have changed over 25 to 100 years or 3,000 years. Which how surprising is that? Oh my gosh, things really have changed over 3,000 years, right? For us, it's the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. That's the big deal.
Not me.
Passover is very, very important.
Not me.
In the Torah, Sukkot was Chag, the festival. That was the time in which the people would come in for their Thanksgiving offering, as well to mark the major national experiences, including the time in which they had the dedication of the first temple by King Solomon, and when Ezra and Nehemiah came back and dedicated the second temple for those who were returning from Babylonian exile. Again, it was on the festival of Sukkot. So what I wanted to look at are just a few of the verses, actually, because very compact and rich Torah portion. And I think we're going to look at about 4 verses, but I have especially interesting, I think, the commentary by Rabbeinu Bachya and we'll get to his commentary and to look at it, something to reflect on as we think of how they dealt with the change of time. I'm going to preface that with something that was quite interesting. An article written by Julius Morgenstern in the 1935 HUC annual, which I'm proud I have. On when does the day begin? And that too is touched on a little bit. Not only when the year begins, when the season begins, when the day begins, all that in this week's Torah portion. So with that, we'll say a little bracha, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praise you, Adonai, our God, creator of the universe, who sanctified us with mitzvot, commanded us to engage with the words of Torah. Real quick with what Morgenstern is talking about. This is an extensive article if you get academic journals or scholarly books, they'll make reference to HUCA, which always stands for Hebrew Union College Annual. One of the great works of scholarship for well over 100 years, and it's a pride, I think, of the Reform movement. Well, Morgenstern wrestled with the idea as to when exactly does the day begin in Judaism, and so what do we know? What is the beginning of the Jewish day?
The evening.
The evening, right? And we look back at the rabbinic teaching, Vayera Vayivoke Yom Echad Yom Sheni, from the beginning of the Torah. But as Morgenstern points out, and making reference to not only textual evidence, but other scholars as well, that frequently when it comes to passages in Leviticus, specifically when it's talking about sacrifices, there is a definite understanding that things had to be completed before the morning, because like the Todah offering, the Tamid offering, all of these had to be offered, consumed, and finished before the morning, as if the morning was the start of a new day. He speculates that the conflict between those two systems, one is that the day begins when the sun has set on one day, and if it sets on one day, automatically, of course, we have the beginning of a new. The other is that no, when the sun rises, that's the beginning of one day, and when it rises the next day, we consider that the new day. Now, we are able to maintain a dual system in our modern world. We understand that there's some abstract point in the middle of the night that determines that a new day has started, right? 11:55 p.m. Does not look any different than 12:05 a.m. And yet, because we're hoity-toity, we can say, okay, there's a new day. In the old world, they were not so interested in the abstract. They wanted to see what nature had to say. So what is the moon looking like? And I hope all of you are seeing that the full moon that we are enjoying on ER 15 last night. It was a little hazy, but big and gorgeous and pink. And our ancestors loved to look up into the sky and see the stars and see the planets and see the moon and judge their time according to that. So as opposed to the abstract in the middle of the day, we might say, well, I have my work day, and when the morning light comes up and you get up out of bed, you say, oh, it's the start of a brand new day. Well, no, I mean, apparently the day started some 7 or 8 hours earlier at midnight, right? But so we maintain this dual sense of connection with time, that being the time that the scientists tell us when the day begins, when culture says the day begins, and when our day really begins. Our day really begins when?
When we wake up.
When we wake up. Exactly right. That's exactly right. So Morgenstern was going on saying that this difference is perhaps reflective of the competing systems that we had not only for the counting of the day, but also the counting of the year. So what's our system for counting the year in the Western culture?
The sun.
The Christian calendar.
Right? 365 days is a solar calendar. And that was an option. That was actually the selected preference for many people, including Jews. The entire book of Jubilees goes on and on with a solar calendar reference. And it wanted to reconfigure the understanding of when our festivals would be in accordance with the solar calendar. But we know, of course, that as I made reference last night, just a few minutes ago, to the moon, it's the 15th day of ER, that we go on a lunar cycle, but not purely a lunar calendar. Why is that? Mark,
they're in balance. The solar and the lunar are in balance because of the 28.5 days to the lunar and a little more for the solar.
Right. So that if you count the number of days that we would have with a lunar calendar, we would lose like 12 and a half days each year. The solar is 365. The lunar is more like 350 something, right? 356 or something like that. So, and it does vary from year to year. Then even in the solar, we have to add once in a while a leap year so that February gets magically an extra day. How wonderful. Well, in Judaism, because of our predilection towards a lunar calendar, we add an extra month, the extra month of Adar. And so there was within Judaism a creditable and forceful push by some to go to the solar calendars, thus the Book of Jubilees, which was quite popular, quite influential, but it was rejected. It was rejected by the rabbis who preferred the lunar calendar. So we have a combination lunar solar, i.e. that we adjust that lunar calendar with a leap month, some 7 times in a 19-year cycle. Islam does not adjust it. What does Islam do?
Have Ramadan.
Well, they do have Ramadan, but they are...
It happens. I don't know how it comes up. I never understood it.
Because it's strictly lunar, right?
Oh, okay.
So for them, because it's strictly lunar, Ramadan right now, it's in the spring. But it will then be a little bit towards the end of winter, and then much in winter, and then eventually in the fall, and then eventually in the summer. So it floats because each year their lunar calendar loses some 13 days. We do too in our Jewish or Hebrew calendar, but we adjust it with the intercalculated month. The reason I wanted to go into that is because so much of this speculation as to when the day begins, when does the month begin? How do we divide up the year? How do we measure the year? Those are crucial as we are about to consider when is Passover, when is Shavuot, when is Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We find within the Talmud great debates, even among the rabbis as they competed with one another. So just by looking at a few verses in chapter 23 of the book of Leviticus, we're going to get a hint of that as they wrestled with it. Of course, they were not so cognizant. Many of the commentators, like Rabbeinu Bachya, et cetera, from 14th century, they were not cognizant of what modern scholarship speculated about the morning or the evening, et cetera. And yet we do. And so we can look at some of these verses and consider why we determine and who gets to determine when those festivals start. So we're going to be looking at just the first 4 verses of chapter 23. And with that, can we get someone just to read this very beginning?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, these are my fixed times, the fixed times of Adonai, which you shall proclaim as sacred occasions."
Right. And this is going to be the crucial part right here, which you shall proclaim. Now we know that, right? Because we don't have God, picking up the phone and say, hey, you know what? We're going to start this on this day and that on this day, ordering up like we do our calendars and putting it on our schedule. We don't have that direct connection with God or some angels or the hosts of heaven coming down and telling us what to do. We have to figure that out, which is why when you put humans in charge of something, it all works perfectly smoothly. There's never dispute. It doesn't work perfectly smoothly.
Oh, never, ever.
And it's always in dispute. And we still are in dispute. Okay, so here it is. You can proclaim the sacred occasions. So we're gonna start off with him, 12th century. Anybody would like to go ahead, Barbara, continue.
Okay. Speak unto the children of Israel and declare unto them the appointed festivals of Adonai. This means regulate the festive seasons in such a manner that all Israel should become practiced in them their observance. Hence we derive the law that they, the Sanhedrin, proclaim a leap year. For example, intercalate a second Adar for the sake of those living in the diaspora who have already left their homes in order to go up for the festival, but have not yet arrived in Jerusalem.
So that's going to be a key thing that Sephorno is going to expand on, that there is a Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. They will determine when the intercalculation, i.e. the second Adar, will be proclaimed. We now, after all of this time, have the calendars that we can pick up at the King Supers or at a mortuary, and they'll tell us exactly when these dates are. And I have books of calendar that go off 100 years in the future that'll tell me exactly when these various festivals are. But they didn't have those calendars, or even if they did have those calendars, they still wanted to rely on the witness system. But that had to be regulated within Jerusalem. And though they sort of knew that they would do about 7 added Adars in a 19-year period, they nevertheless had the opportunity to add even more than that if they felt that there was an important reason to do so. So this is Sforno, 16th century Italian. He has an amazing passage explaining the system as well. So Barbara, would you continue with that?
Speak to the Israelite people after the Torah had spoken on the subject of the animal offerings and the people offering them, whose purpose it is to ensure that the Shekinah rests in over the people of Israel. The Torah spoke of the festivals, days on which one abstains from the pursuit of secular matters. On some of these days, one has to abstain from such activities completely, on others only partially. For instance, on the Sabbath, as well as on the Day of Atonement, there is a total cessation of everything which is called work.
Malacha. Malacha is creative work, not the work as defined by physics, i.e. lifting up something can be work, but rather work for one's occupation.
In the sense of a productive activity. These days are meant for us to occupy ourselves exclusively with Torah and other sacred tasks. To this effect, the Torah wrote, Exodus 29:10, you shall labor for 6 days and conduct all your activities, whereas the 7th day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. On that day, your activities should concern spiritual matters.
Okay, and it continues on.
On some of the days described as holy convocations, there is a partial prohibition of work, desisting basically from the kind of activity related to the kind of labor involved in earning one's livelihood. One is to enjoy these days. Concerning such days, our sages coined the phrase,
Chatzil Adonai v'chatzil lechem, half for God and half for you.
There is no doubt that when the Jewish people conduct themselves in this fashion, that the divine presence will be at home among them. Asaph expressed his thought in Psalms 82:1, which commences with the words,
Elohim nitzav be'adat el. So God stands in the divine assembly.
among the divine beings, he pronounces judgment. The meaning of the word,
Mikra Kodesh.
when applied to the days, the Torah calls.
Moed Adonai. So Mikra Kodesh are the proclaimed holy days, and these are refers to the days where that the Torah calls Moedei Adonai, the specific days that God has proclaimed, Asher Tikra'u Otam, which you shall proclaim. That's what we just read at the very beginning.
Days of assembles of people for sacred undertakings. The word
Mikra.
refers to an assembly, just as the words are in. Go ahead.
Yes, Shabbat and Chodesh.
Oh, hello. Are understood as meaning assemblies both in Isaiah 1:13 and Isaiah 4:5.
Now, that's not so clear to us because we say Shabbat, okay, I understand. We go to shul on Shabbat. But for Rosh Chodesh too, now back in the day, the Rosh Chodesh, or the lunar observance of the new moon, was of much greater significance than it is today. Today we do have some added liturgical mention of the Chodesh, but not too many of us are rushing to the shul for a special service because it's Rosh Chodesh, this, that, or the other. And okay, Barbara, you had a lot of reading, but you have one more paragraph. It says,
Okay.
These are the appointed dates on which I will demonstrate my pleasure in your company. And so if you'll continue with Sparring, you.
If you were to treat these dates as ordinary days, weekdays, they would turn from being
Mikra Kodesh, or holy days, holy assemblies, to Mikra Chol, or just banal or commonplace assemblies.
assemblies devoted exclusively to the transient life on earth and the physical pleasures people want to experience in this life. They would then not be
Moedai, my appointed times.
That would turn into
Moedai, Sinat Nafshi, your appointed times, is the ones my soul detests. So it's an interesting thing that that the Sophornos reminding us that yes, Tikra'u Otam, you get to be the ones who Tikra'u Otam, you get to be the ones who declare them. And later on, Rabbeinu Bachya will go on with the difference between Otam and Atem, i.e. Otam is you shall proclaim them, but Atem is you, emphasizing the role that each of us have in declaring what is the festivals. Now, the reason I mention this, and Yoni and I had an interesting conversation the other day, and I make reference to this as well, because we think, oh, in the Reform movement or in the non-Orthodox movement, there our take on the importance of these Jewish observances, whether it's a Shabbat or if it's a festival or for Kashrut for that matter, but we'll keep it to the time-bound pieces, that they are radically different. And there is a fact that, of course, the level of observance within the Orthodox community is going to be greater. And yet they too, nevertheless, have to make the decision as to, well, how am I going to observe this? In what ways do I need to fudge this or adjust on this observance in order to survive in this world and to make accommodation for the necessities of life? In either case, whether you're Reform or Orthodox, you're still in charge of determining what it is. And just because someone says, oh, I'm Orthodox, doesn't mean that they're all that perfectly observant. They also have the same kind of challenges that we have as well. Barbara.
This young man who I've been tutoring, communicating with in Israel for quite some time now, he is modern Orthodox, and he was offered a job where he would have to work on Saturday. But it was an organization, it was a tech company that handles accounts for religious groups or something. I don't know all the details. Anyway, so he went to his rabbi and he said, they're telling me I have to work on Saturday. And he discussed it with his rabbi. And because of the type of work this company does, he gave him dispensation to work on Saturday.
Right. Well, there are.
Figure.
Well, you're right, but and there are those who would have been more machmir, more strict on that, and yet, what is a crucial business? Now you might say, well, the doctors and nurses, they are crucial. That's the koach nefesh. Okay, but what about the person who works at the power and light company? Who, if that person is not working on Shabbat or Yom Kippur, for that matter, if they don't have a crew working it, there won't be electricity for the well-being of all of society. And you say, okay, well, there shouldn't be electricity on that day. Well, you still need other people to work at the water and sewage plant, right? So what's crucial, what's pekuach nefesh, expands greatly when you look at the macro level of our modern society. We're not in a little shtetl. We're not pre-modern. We are dealing with millions of people that we have to provide water for, power for, health for, and to support their survival. How can you say the water is not important for a full day, right? So all of and certainly you want to flush a toilet. So all of these are crucial businesses. So there are dispensations. And that's exactly, Barbara, what we were talking about. Thank you for bringing that up, because if you just look at it at the text and read it literally, okay, there's no malachat, there's no work. But that's not the case. We still have to have the work done. Okay, I'll give you another example. Let's say you're a farmer. You say that's very simple. You have a well, you don't need running water. You have the outhouse, you don't need the sewage plant. It's a very simple rustic life. Okay, and so you can keep a perfect Shabbat, right? Except for what if you have milk cows? It's quite common, even if you don't have a herd of milk cows, you probably will have a cow or two, because you still need to feed your family. So what happens with a milk cow if you don't milk that cow on a single day, like on a Shabbat?
Oh, it's going to explode.
It's going to explode, right? It's going to die, right? So what do?
They have to milk it.
They have to milk it.
It'll work.
And you can say, well, we can find someone who's not Jewish to milk it. Yeah, really? Well, what does the Torah say? It says, this would be a Shabbat for you and for the stranger in your midst. Right? For all of your workers as well, it should be Shabbat. So how do you make it happen? Tikro olatam. You're going to have to figure it out, people. It's not just abstract. Now, there are those within our long history, the Karaites are most infamous for this, who said, no, we got to pretend that we have to go as strictly literal as possible, and we're going to spend the entire Shabbat sitting in the dark. And there they do. So, but they're going to still have to find someone to milk their cows, because they're not going to have any chance of survival if their milk cows die after 1 week.
Yeah.
Right. So let's get back to anybody else? All right. Anyone who wants to volunteer to milk a cow? Lori wants to. Good. All right, let's get to it. So this next little piece, again, I'm only covering 4 verses, so don't think, oh, goodness, we're halfway done. Well, we are, but with the next 2 comments are a little bit more lengthy, especially Rabbeinu Bach. So who else would like to read? Because after it says, you're going to declare our festivals. You're going to declare the festivals, the great holy assemblies of the Lord. But the first thing it mentions is not Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, or for that matter, Passover or Sukkot or Shavuot. Rather, the first thing it mentions is Shabbat. So who'd like to read from this section?
I'll read, but
Thank
I
you,
lost
Alan.
my video. Yeah, you can't see me, but you know my voice. On 6 days work may be done, but on the 7th day there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest, a sacred occasion. You shall do work. It shall be a Sabbath Adonai throughout your settlements.
Good. Now that's the key to what the Talmud's going to have, both in Tractate Shabbat and throughout rabbinic literature. I.e., what does it mean that you shall do no manner of malacha? And so in time we'll look at this more extensively at another session. But they've come up with all of the creative work that was necessary to make the Mishkan. The Mishkan, this tabernacle that we had in the wilderness, required the preparation of wood, of the preparation of creating yarn and thread and dyeing it and tying it and creating knots and creating poles and creating all the vessels for it. So it might mean smelting and shaping and forming and pouring and smoothing. And they added up all of the various activities necessary to build the Mishkan, to build the Ohel HaMoed, the tent of meeting that was in the wilderness. They came up with 39 melechot, 39 activities that were crafts, work, artistic endeavors that were required. And those became the categories of work, of occupation, then that defined what that malacha was. But it also says, thou shalt not. So, and again, we're not going to belabor the issue, but we still have to decide who's thou, who's you, right? You and not your worker. Well, the Torah is not so clear. And you being a minor or just a major. And then it comes to not. Does not mean never ever. What are the exceptions? So it's knowing that that's going to be covered and had been covered already, that Torah brings in that before we're going to talk about the festivals, I want to remind everyone about the importance of Shabbat, number one, but also the rules and the flexibilities, the ways of interpretation for Shabbat are also going to be incorporated for the interpretation of how we observe the festivals. So let's get back to our text. And who would like to read Sephorno? Margie, you want, or Lori? One of you? Go ahead, Margie.
Mute. The creator of light and darkness assigns these days in all your dwellings, wherever on earth. The reason this is spelled out is that we might have thought that just as days and nights are not constant, being longer in the summer than in the winter respectively, so that the hours of the first Sabbath in history might serve as the model for all future Sabbaths, and Jews all over the world ought to observe the 24 hours, which Jews in the land of Israel observe as their Sabbath.
And that's not exactly right, because the hours in Judaism, because they are on this sunrise, sunset, sunset to sunset feature are a little bit different. So the hours of the day are a little bit longer in the summer and shorter in the winter, and that too is giving a little bit of a hint to what Morgenstern was going on about. That what we call a day is still going to be up to us. When we're going to count the day, how we count that day. Please continue.
The Torah, by writing
B'chol moshbetechem, in all of your settlements,
indicates that the commencement and conclusion of the Sabbath depends on the local times of day and night, not on a central location, as opposed to the determination of the monthly time when the new moon, i.e. the new month, begins, which is related to its astronomical constellation in the sky over Jerusalem, which serves as the date line for the Jewish people.
Okay, can you make heads or tails of that?
Yeah, I think it's trying to find a central authority among the people, on earth, in order to, have unity, really. It's a little hard.
Yeah, well, okay, so the new moon was going to be declared by the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, right? Mm-hmm. And so the diaspora doesn't get a say on that. It's the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. But the new day and the hours, we can't wait on. That's, you know, a month is every 29 days or so. But who want to say when the sunset is for us in Denver? I can't go by what it is in Jerusalem. So what Sephora was making sure that we understood is that the diaspora has control as to the declaration of the days, of the times within those days, in accordance with its own geography. He would know that because he knows that when he was in Italy, their date and time was a lot different than it was in Jerusalem. Is anybody watching any of those Discovery Channel things about on life in Alaska? A couple of you? I'm fascinated by that. Now, Susan always looks at me, she says, Rick, why are you fascinated by that? You don't hunt, you don't fish, and you sure as hell are not going to go out there camping where there are bears. And she's right on all three of those. I'm not going to do any of those things. But I'm fascinated by these people who live out in the middle of nowhere. But one of the things that's really cool is that the sun sets in their summer like never. Right?
Oh, I've been there.
Right? So
Never sets.
So
No.
what is Shabbos, right? Right.
Find the 5 Jews who live there, and they'll tell you.
Right.
But it's still bright at 10 o'clock at night.
Right. So you can't. They said, you know what? It's the local people. If the local people says, okay, we're not going to start, our Shabbos at 10 o'clock at night. We're going to start it at 6 o'clock at night, so we can get home and have our cholent and our herring, or do whatever. We're going to enjoy it. We get to govern that, but we don't get to govern when the new month is. So that's basically what it's sharing.
Rabbi,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
how about life in Manhattan? There's no cow, so I was in trouble. I couldn't milk a cow.
I didn't
Can you hear me?
What was it?
I said, what about life in Manhattan? Well, if there was cows there, I couldn't milk them.
There used to be cows on Manhattan. You just have to go back far enough. There were all kinds of farms in what ultimately became Central Park.
Oh, yes.
And Brooklyn was a farm area.
Brooklyn was what?
Okay, here we go.
I missed it. Okay.
Let's get to this. This is our last verse that we're going to look at, because Rabbeinu Bachya goes to town. Anyway, so after they had this little, I'm going to talk about the festivals, but first I'm going to remind you about the importance of Shabbat. Then Ela Moedei Adonai, these are the set times of Adonai. Mikra'e Kodesh, times of sacred assembly. Specifically, Asher Tikra'u Otam B'moadam, that you will declare, but it does say B'moadam, at its appointed time, at the time that that God has ordained through the Torah. So which then takes precedent? The appointed time, that which you think God really wants us to have our Passover on this time and not that time? Or is it that we get to declare it, to delay it, to move it up, or whatever? So how much control do we have? That's going to be a little bit of attention. So Rabbeinu Bachya, this 13th century, 14th century Spaniard, magnificent commentary. I don't know, Margie, why don't you read some of it, and then Lori, we can get you some of that too.
These are the appointed times of the Lord, holy convocations, which you are to proclaim. The Torah describes all the festivals as related to the attribute Hashem. The reason the word
Ele.
What is it?
Ele.
Ele is used to introduce them is that the word symbolizes something permanent and enduring. The message is that these festivals will not become redundant through historic developments in the future. Is that another way of saying to make it transcendent?
In a way, but it again, Rabbeinu Bachya was also at a time when people were wondering, well, when's the Messianic era going to happen, right?
Oh, okay.
And while we get to declare it in human time, there will come a time when the Mashiach comes and sets us all straight.
Okay. Permanent enduring. The message is that these festivals will not become redundant as long as this physical universe will continue to exist, the Jewish people will continue to observe these festivals. This is also what is meant when the Torah wrote the words,
Lanu ula benenu ad olam, for us and our children forever.
For us and our children forever, the laws of the Torah apply for all foreseeable future times. Wow.
Tanchuma is a collection of midrashim.
Tanchuma Pinchas relates that a Gentile once asked Rabbi Akiva why the Jews were still celebrating the festivals when the prophet Isaiah had told the people that God hated your new moons and your festivals, etc. Rabbi Akiva answered that if Isaiah had spoken of my new moons, my festivals,
My, with the emphasis on the
my new moons, my festivals, instead of your new moons and your festivals, he would have a point. What God hated were the festivals introduced by King Jeroboam, which were meant to supplement or to supplant the festivals described in the Torah here. We have been told in 1 Kings that King Jeroboam introduced a festival in the 8th month to supplant Sukkot in the 7th month, a month he had chosen of his own will.
Right. Now, hold on for just a second on this, because this is something we still get a little bit of an echo to this day. You'll look at certain Jewish calendars, and they won't have in there Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut, some of the more, or Yom HaShoah. You might think Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Observance Day, that's not going to be in this Jewish calendar. And there was a sense that, wait a minute, we don't get the chance to, or we don't have the right to create new sacred days. Even though they're important days historically, we're limited to what the Torah had to say. Now that's within certain communities. Of course, within most modern Orthodox, and of course within the non-Orthodox, we reject that wholeheartedly, saying that, no, we have absolutely every right to create something new, even though it was not mentioned in the biblical canon. So, and what's our halakhic justification for that? What major festival is not mentioned in the biblical canon, the biblical books that are accepted by our people?
Hanukkah.
Hanukkah, exactly right. Now Purim, you can say, well, that was after the Torah, but at least we have the Book of Esther. But we do not have Hanukkah. In fact, we could have, if they would have accepted the books of the Maccabees in the canon, but they did not. And so the rabbis nevertheless allowed there to be the observance of Hanukkah. Interestingly, there's not a special tractate in the Talmud to Hanukkah. You read only about Hanukkah in tractate Shabbat. So there was some hesitancy to add new observances. Sacred assemblies, but in the modern world, we have been much more free to do so. And so we get a little bit of that echo in Rabbanu Bachya. Barbara.
If I'm understanding and reading this properly, I was kind of interested. It seems like they were giving God human qualities. And that struck me.
Yeah.
I don't know how to react to that. How do people know what God wants?
Well, I think we all want to know what God wants. And more importantly, we want God to want what we want, right? And we get really frustrated when what we want is not what happens. And so then we think, well, God rejected what I want, or maybe that wasn't even a part of the possibility. So it's quite human, and it's an interesting philosophical phenomenon that we always project onto God a personality that reflects our own, and that's a little bit of our own arrogance. That surely God wants what I want. And of course, then we will project upon God certain human characteristics. God is angry, or God is loving, God is healing, God is creative, God is forgiving. And these are all human terms, which Maimonides took us to task, saying, yeah, you might use those words because that's all you have. You only have human language with which to express yourself. But don't think that God is actually angry in a human way, or even loving in a human way. God's not a human being. Which is, again, then bring it back to our topic, why it's not up to, we're not given the privilege of asking God what the heck you mean by that mimocharat Shabbat, when it says you shall start counting the Omer mimocharat Shabbat. Is that Shabbat being the day of rest of Passover, or is that mimocharat Shabbat being the day after the Sabbath of the Passover week? And there were differences of opinion. The rabbi said, no, it's the day after the first Seder. The Sadducees said, no. It's the Sabbath of the Passover week. That's when you start counting, right? And so there's a differences of opinion for that too as well. And so because we can't ask God's opinion, we have to make it up. We have to do our best.
Yeah.
Hopefully we do that with enough humility. So when there are those who disagree with us, we would say, well, you make a good point and you may be right, but we have to make as good a consensus as we can. And therefore, though you may be right, we're going to do something different because most of us think that it's something else, right? And it's the humility that all too often is missing. Margie.
Do you think it's fair to say that humans can't know the mind of God?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I think even to pretend that we might know would be ridiculous. Jerry.
Yeah, I heard a very interesting statistic this morning that due to the melting of the polar ice, the mass of the Earth is changing and the axis of the Earth is shifting 4 inches per year towards Europe. And I'm just wondering how that might eventually affect sunrise and sunset times and things like that in the future.
Very, very interesting. Margie, go ahead.
And well, that was what was so interesting to me reading that last piece, is there was some conditionality about whether the world would go on. And that's the first time I've encountered that.
Well, don't forget, we've gone through that to a great extent over the past summer, in which we were reading a lot of the mystical or Kabbalistic writings. And there was great messianic expectation. And we still find that to this day. I mean, there are people who are, most infamously was the Y2K predictions, in which serious people, not mystical lunatics, but scientists were going, oh, the computers are all going to crash and our electrical grid will burn and society is all going to, Y2K was 21 years ago. And people really freaked out. So it's not hard to get humans who are quite impressionable, all worked up about one thing or the other. That doesn't mean that we don't have a lot to worry about. We should worry about our electrical grid. We should worry about the safety of our computers, et cetera, because so much rides on them. Gosh almighty, although I don't indulge in it because I'm not interested in Twit or Snap or one of the other crazy things that they do on the computer. But there's all kinds of people who are speculating with one conspiracy theory after the other. I know one. This came out on the news like 3 days ago, and it was one of the reporters for, I think it was the CBS channel. She's interviewing someone because it's the anti-vaxxers. Oh my God. So they're asking, why are these young people not get 16 years old and older? You're allowed to get their vaccination, right? Why are these young people not doing the vaccination? You think, well, young people, would be more open to it, and it's their future. They've got so much. And the reporter said, and I can't believe she said this. Well, many of them are worried that it will make them sterile, so they won't be able to. They'll lose their fertility, and they won't be able to have children. So she then took what was an obscure, mind-bogglingly stupid rumor on the internet, and she broadcast it on the modern news.
Mhm.
And so now people are saying, "Oh, I just heard on the news that it can cause sterilization," right? So that's the world we live in, Margie.
I wasn't thinking so much of the fear as his sort of just physical. It's hard. I live with this scientist who works at the museum, and who knows, when things were, how many million years, and this and that, and how they change. And here I'm looking at a rabbinic voice who's open to that. More than any I'd heard.
There was an understanding, and certainly is, that what we have is not forever,
Mhm.
right? And one day, the life as we know it will no longer be, right? And so we have, but to indulge in the speculation as to when it will happen,
different.
that makes you vulnerable to the charlatans that are out there. Right.
And that's why we need science. Yeah.
Exactly. Go ahead, Mark.
What's
Well, I like what Woody Allen had to say about it. He said, "The universe is expanding, so I shouldn't have to turn in my homework."
Well, Woody Allen said, asked about death. He said, "There's no problem with that, but I wouldn't want to be there."
Right.
And the other COVID thing is these young ball players in their 20s, athletes, they're strong, and they come down with the COVID. And and they say, how could that be?
Right. Okay, so let's get back to our text real quick. There's a lot more of Rabbeinu Bachya. I don't know if we're going to get to it, but Laura, do you want to read from here on furthermore?
Sure. Furthermore, it is written in verse 38 of our chapter, apart from the Sabbath days of the Lord, etc., the repetition of the word Eleh, these, in verse 37 of our chapter, plus the word
Elevad, which means besides.
In verse, what does it mean?
Besides.
Besides.
Over in addition to those things that were mentioned earlier.
Okay. In verse 38, or the Torah's way of saying that no other festivals are to be considered as God's festivals. The ones listed in our portion will never be abolished. This is why they are called God's festivals. Concerning these festivals, the psalmist said in Psalms 111, verse 8, they are well founded for all eternity, wrought of truth and equity. Which you will proclaim. The word meaning them is spelled without the letter
Vav,
so right, that it may be understood as
atem or you. So otam would be them, or atem is a pronoun for you.
You will determine when to proclaim the proper time for these festivals. Our sages in Rosh Hashanah 25 use this textual nuance to derive the authority of the Sanhedrin to rearrange the calendar in such a way that the festivals occur in the seasons determined by the Torah, although if we were to follow the strictly lunar calendar, this would prove utterly impossible. The authority of the Supreme Court in these matters is so great that even if they hand down an astronomically incorrect decision, the decision is not revoked. The sages found an additional verse in Exodus where the Torah wrote, "This month is for you," as proof that God granted authority to you, that is, to your leaders, to determine the precise time when a new moon is to be declared.
Right, and that's the key, i.e., the humility to say, we're going to determine when Passover should begin, when Rosh Hashanah should begin, etc. And guess what? We may be wrong. God may have actually intended a different day. In the passage in Rosh Hashanah 25, and we've covered this in years past, made reference to the dispute between Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua, who were the head and the vice president of the Sanhedrin. They disputed as to when the correct day of when Rosh Hashanah was, and more importantly, then from Rosh Hashanah when Yom Kippur would be. And there was a dispute over their calendar. And Gamliel probably was wrong, but he was the boss, and the people voted to support his opinion. Joshua was really upset, and it led to all kinds of a dramatic confrontation. And yet, at the conclusion of it, the lesson was: look, we may not be right in certain cases, but if we divide, and you have your calendar and I have my calendar, someone else has a third calendar, we won't be unified. We won't have a community. We will be at odds. And we are now facing, as Gamliel was, a time of trying to rebuild Judaism after the destruction of the temple, after the exile. We can't afford civil war right now. We can't afford to have abstract debates over calendar. We have to have one calendar, one people, one way to go. So don't give me the academic answer that, oh, I'm right and therefore I'm going to go do my own thing. No, you may be right, but you can't do your own thing, right? So too we find in Pirkei the Rebbe Eliezer. Go ahead, Lori.
So too we find in Pirkei the Rabbi Eliezer. The universe, that is, sun and moon in their orbits, to make the concept of time and a calendar meaningful, was created starting with the 28th day in Elul. God was forced to make an adjustment to the commencement of the new year, seeing that the 28th of Elul was simultaneously the fourth day of creation, so that Adam was created on the 30th day of that month, at which time he handed over the calendar manipulations to Adam. This is the meaning of the words.
Sefer Toldot Adam. These are the book of the descendants of Adam. And it continues on by saying that, okay, even though we have to make the decision from Adam on, Adam then gave it to Hanoch, and Hanoch gave it to Noach, or to Shem, to Noach, etc., all the way down to Abraham, down to Yaakov, to Israel, etc. Let's continue on. So that, i.e., we do have a little bit of a tradition as to what God wants. It's a little hedging the bet there with the idea that we're sort of making it up as we go along. Lori, go ahead, where it says, and the word lemor
in Exodus 12:1 meant that God said to Moses that up until that time, since the descent into Egypt, he had kept the secret of how to make these calculations to himself. Whereas at that point in time, he was releasing this information. As long as the Jewish people lived in the land of Israel, they exercised this authority, adding an extra month from time to time to bring the seasons into harmony with the lunar calendar and to compensate for the fact that the moon's orbit was 29 days and a fraction of the 30th day, so that the month had to have either 29 or 30 days.
When most people.
When most of the Jewish people were exiled to Babylon or went to Egypt, the calendar manipulation was taken care of by the few Jews remaining in the Holy Land. When the prophet Ezekiel requested permission from God to perform this task in Babylon, God told him that no one was permitted to perform this task except within the Holy Land. This prompted the sages to establish the rule that whereas the wise men and righteous people in the diaspora do not have the authority to tamper with the calendar, even herdsmen in the land of Israel do have such authority. Even prophets outside the land of Israel lack this authority, whereas laymen inside of the land of Israel do have the authority to adjust the calendar. Only when no Jew remained in the land of Israel did they begin to adjust the calendar in Babylon. As soon as Ezra moved to the land of Israel, they began to adjust the calendar there. And when Ezekiel asked permission to do this in Babylon, God told him that it was
The exclusive.
the
Prerogative.
exclusive prerogative of the, let's see,
People living in the land of Israel.
and Israel.
Okay,
Something about, okay.
Go ahead, Laurie.
Screen anymore.
No. Instead of reading, because we're at 1 o'clock already.
Oh,
wanna
no,
do-
I didn't have anything to say.
Okay. So again, wouldn't they have the primacy of Israel as opposed to the diaspora? Because again, if you're trying to hold all of our people together, and we know that we have some people that are in the far east, which is either Persia or Babylon. We have some people in the far west, which may be at the time of Rabbeinu Bachia, which would be Spain or Portugal or Northern Africa. Already he was aware that there'd be people in the far north, which would be up in Austria or Germany or even further north than that, that all of a sudden these various diasporas will start to tinker and create their own calendars. If we started to tinker with our own calendar, then we'll start having different observances, different times, and we would truly break down into smaller and smaller sects, no longer feel that we were all Klal Yisrael, that we were one family of Israel. So being strict that way about limiting the diaspora's decision as to the declaration of the festivals was important. As to when the day begins, that we did have. And that sort of reflected a little bit what I wanted to start, that I started out with what Morgenstern said almost 100 years ago in the HSC annual, in which we do too to this day. When is this day beginning? When is this, when is the Sabbath beginning? Now, one last little piece of that. So last week was the last time we're going to do the public Havdalah, right? The public Havdalah. Why? Because already it's sunset is getting later and later. It's not, pretty soon it's going to be 8 o'clock. Pretty soon after that, it's going to be 9, 9:30, etc. And who could stay up that night to do Havdalah? So some Reform rabbis with a straight face, and not so other rabbis, not just Reform, would say, well, Sabbath ends year-round at 6 o'clock. And so my kids at a camp, at a Jewish camp, Reform movement camp, they said, well, they're doing Havdalah at 6 o'clock. I said, well, for God's sakes, it's July. The sun's not setting until 9:30, right? They said, yeah, but then if we wait until 9:30, the kids have to go to bed and it's up too late. And we want because Havdalah is so pretty. So the Torah would say, well, they have some leeway, probably not that much. But that's what happens when you give people that authority to declare when the day begins, when the Shabbos begins, etc. So I can begin Shabbos early, but what can't I do? I can't end it early. So if you go to Israel in July, people will start their services still, or their Shabbos is at 6 o'clock, right? Maybe 7 at the latest, but still it's 2 hours or more before sunset. So you can add to the Sabbath, you can add to the holiness, but you can't take away from the holiness. So that it gives us a little bit of that tension between what our role is, being, of course, observant of the authenticity of the Sabbath, of the festivals, etc. Our needs versus, of course, the authenticity of the tradition. Go ahead, Arnie.
Just in that light, I got a question. Years ago, when I was very frum, I was up in Hudson's Bay for rotations in the winter. And those years, I actually did Minchas Maariv. And it talk about confusing. I mean, the sun went down at like 2 in the afternoon. And I remember trying to determine, I couldn't determine it. And they told me back home, just do it according to the time that it was going on back home. Again, I didn't realize there was any leeway there. Is that, how do one does one approach that?
No, that's a wonderful tradition. You can, if you are a visitor at a place, you can either adopt the minhag hamakom, the way they're observing it in the new place, but more importantly, you should probably observe it just in your old place. It gets back to the person, the very orthodox, very frum astronaut who was going around the earth, and he said, how was it? He says, it was great, except for every 15 minutes, it was shakrit mincha mari, because I always going around, and there's another sunset, another sunrise. Anyway, so he needed some dispensation. Listen, guys, I hope I get to see you on Thursday. We're going to have a very special program on Thursday. So Lunch and Learn, that will involve Lag BaOmer, some special readings as well. So I hope that you'll be that. Lag BaOmer is the 33rd day of the Omer. Yoni has promised to get out his famous bonfire virtual image. So that's going to be very cool. So no pressure, Yoni. And we'll have some nice treats as well. I look forward to seeing you on Thursday, and please give my best to all. Be safe and good. And if you are interested in coming to Temple, let us know. Sign up and we'll come see you. Take care, everybody.